Support for this episode of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere is brought to you by MX Publishing, with the largest catalog of new Sherlock Holmes books in the world. New novels, biographies, graphic novels, and short story collections about Sherlock Holmes. Find them at mxpublishing.com.
And by the Wessex Press, the premier publisher of books about Sherlock Holmes and his world. Find them online at wessexpress.com.
I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, episode 216, Remembering Jon Lellenberg.
I hear of Sherlock everywhere since you became a chronicler.
In a world where it's always 1895, comes I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, a podcast for devotees of Mr. Sherlock Holmes, the world's first unofficial consulting detective.
I've heard of you before. You're Holmes the meddler, Holmes the busybody, Holmes the Scotland Yard Jack in office.
The game's afoot as we discuss goings-on in the world of Sherlock Holmes enthusiasts, the Baker Street Irregulars, and popular culture related to the great detective.
As we go to press, sensational developments have been reported.
So join your hosts, Scott Monty and Burt Wolder, as they talk about what's new in the world of Sherlock Holmes.
You couldn't have come at a better time!
Well, hello there, and welcome to I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, the first podcast for Sherlock Holmes devotees where it's always 1895. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And Burt, hey, you know what? I just realized today is National Straw Hat Day.
Yes, it is. It's the time of year when all gentlemen put aside their felt hats and take out their terrific Panama hats and straw caps to enjoy spring and summer.
Well, I, for one, am ready to celebrate with the weather here. The show notes for this episode are available at ihose.co/ihose216. That's all lowercase. There you can find links to some of the episodes we're going to mention today, as well as any books or associated sites to which we will send you. And there you can also leave us a comment to let us know how we're doing here. And if you wouldn't mind letting people know what you think about the show, if you leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, that would be extremely helpful. You don't have to have an iPhone to do that. Go right ahead and let people know what you think about I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere. Well, this isn't really an episode that we're looking forward to, but it is nonetheless an episode that we felt we had to do. In the past couple of weeks, we learned that Jon Lellenberg has passed away. Jon was a legendary Sherlockian, Doylean, and researcher. He contributed widely to the topics, the subject, for decades. We had him on the show for a number of times to discuss some of his work, along with Dan Stasauer in a few of those cases. And we just thought it would be an opportunity for us to reflect on the Sherlockian, Doylean career of Jon Lellenberg and to acknowledge some of his contributions.
You really described that very well, because that's the key to Jon. He was a unique person in that he's one of the very, very, very few who was expert, absolutely expert, deeply knowledgeable, thoroughly researched, well-grounded, wrote considerably in the three areas of Arthur Conan Doyle, Sherlock Holmes, and also Christopher Morley in the early and the founding of the Baker Street Irregulars. And it's a shame in looking back at the four times that we did talk with Jon that we didn't do more. But it's a wonderful opportunity, at least for me, to hear his voice again and to bring back some of the magnificent work that he did and the discoveries that he made, and to put his many contributions to our hobby and this interest in some perspective, and to share him with all of you who may not have had the experience of talking with him and hearing his voice.
Yeah, that's exactly right. We had an opportunity to talk with Jon on 4 separate occasions. As I mentioned, 3 of those were with Dan Stasauer. The first was episode 13, where we talked about A Life in Letters, as they looked at, again, another biography of Conan Doyle. Episode, 37 was the lost manuscript of John Smith, and we talked with both of them there. And then we talked with the 2 of them as a pair, finally on episode 49, looking at Dangerous Work, which was a look at the whaling journal of Conan Doyle. And then we had Jon on by himself, I believe, episode 29, for his novel Baker Street Irregular, which really took some of his knowledge of the early BSIs and of spy-bound Washington, of which he had quite an extensive knowledge, both modern and historical. So, and to me, one of the things that Jon will always be remembered for, probably one of the first areas where I got to know him, was not only through his extensive writings in the Baker Street Journal, but in his role as the Thucydides of the Baker Street Irregulars. This was a role Jon held for quite a while, as he was writing the first 5 volumes of the BSI's history series, or the archival series, as it's known. These red-backed volumes that looked very much like the red-backed volumes that Edgar Smith put out in the 1950s, as the BSI was rejuvenating its desire to publish. The BSI history series was, I think, one of the first efforts specifically in that area.
One of the things you'll hear today as we revisit these conversations with Jon, and as Scott, as you say, this ran chronologically, this ran from November of 2007, when we first talked to him about the book Life in Letters, to December 2012, when we talked to him about the book Dangerous Work. So it's during the course of those 5 years that we covered these topics. But one of the things you'll hear, listeners, when you hear some of these conversations, is his enormous love and nostalgia. Oddly enough, nostalgia for a time in which he was not alive. Jon, I think Jon was 75 this year when he passed.
Yeah, I think he was born in 1946.
Yeah, so he had a great nostalgic love for a time in which he did not live. But then many of us, shared this enthusiasm for him. But one of the things you'll hear is how that focus, that interest, that great affinity he felt for that time, that historical fascination he had for some of these details, characterized his affection for the Baker Street Irregulars and his and a lot of his scholarly work too.
That is certainly correct. And before we go any further and get into these clips, I should note that we have a couple of things worth noting. One, the prize for the quiz this time around, which we'll do the quiz after we get through all of these clips, our canonical couplets quiz. The prize is a copy of Jon's work, The Quest for Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, 13 Biographers in Search of a Life. It's kind of a survey volume where he goes through some of the biographers that had attempted to capture Conan Doyle, not a single one of them well or comprehensively. And I think this was the elusiveness of Conan Doyle that, Jon was constantly seeking. So we do have a copy of this book with a foreword from Dame Jean Conan Doyle. And then the other thing worth noting is we will have a link in the show notes to this. There is an eBay auction that we're going to be putting up for probably one of the rarest Baker Street Journal Christmas annuals that you will ever experience. It is the 1998 Bsj Christmas Annual. This is the first time that when the Bsj resurrected the Christmas Annual tradition, and it's been going every year since. But this was the first Christmas Annual in, 38 years, I believe. And it's by Jon, and it's called Entertainment and Fantasy, the 1940 BSI dinner. So in some ways, this was an excerpt from the great work that Jon was doing in the BSI history series, but he specifically looked at that 1940 BSI dinner, which itself was so important because it was the resurrection of the BSI. It had been fallow for a couple of years, and Edgar Smith came in. This was Edgar Smith's first entry to the Baker Street Irregulars, and it's a significant publication. So look for that on eBay if you would like a chance to win that auction. And I'm sure we can put the proceeds towards something helpful, like the John H. Watson Fund, which helps people get to the BSI weekend, or to the BSI Trust, something along those lines. So would love to have your interest in bidding in that particular item. So why don't we get to the clips? As you said, Bert, we first had a conversation with Jon and Dan on episode 13, which would have been back in 2007. And this was concerning the biography they had both worked on called Arthur Conan Doyle, A Life in Letters. And as the title implies, they were looking through a lot of correspondence that Conan Doyle left behind. And there's an interesting comment here that I thought was worth surfacing, because Jon was the American representative to the Conan Doyle estate. This was an important role at the time, as the Conan Doyle estate still was overseeing a lot of stories that were in public, not in public domain, were still protected by copyright. And Jon had a lot of dealings directly with Dame Jean Conan Doyle, who was the only surviving child of Conan Doyle by that time. And we talked with him a little bit about what he could tell us about Dame Jean and her personality and how she approached this.
Adrian and Dennis Conan Doyle were the sons by the second marriage, as was Jean. She was the youngest of the three children by between Arthur Conan Doyle and Jean Lucky. And Jean thought her father a great man just as much as her brothers did. But she went about that with a considerably sunnier personality than they did. She was quite a commanding personality in her own right. She had joined the Royal Air Force in 1938. She did intelligence work during the war. She stayed in afterwards until she was a general in the RAF and the highest ranking woman in it. She had been an aide de camp to the Queen. And after retiring, she married a retired Air Vice Marshal in the RAF named Sir Geoffrey Bromett. And she thought it was a shame that her father's papers were locked away as long as they were because of this litigation, which was between her and her brother Adrian's widow, Anna, on one side, and her brother Dennis's widow, Nina, on the other. This went on a long, long time. In fact, quite a while after Nina died, because she died without direct heirs. She died intestate. Her other kin had to be found. And it went through quite a long process, but until late 1997. But it was Jean's hope, particularly, that her father's letters to her grandmother should be published one day, because she felt that they represented his life and his mind so faithfully. And it was a goal that she charged her chosen executor, Charles Foley, with. As you said, Charles is Arthur Conan Doyle's great nephew. His grandmother was Conan Doyle's younger sister, Ida, who had married a cousin, Nelson Foley, who was part of Arthur Conan Doyle's mother's family. She was Mary Foley originally, before marrying Arthur's father. And Charles feels the family legacy very keenly as well, so this has been a project very dear to his heart as it was to Jean's.
Hmm. Well, that kind of familiarity, as it were, was essential as far as Jon's work goes. And we were fortunate to have someone like him who had such a good relationship with Dame Jean and then with Charles Foley as well.
Yes, indeed. And I think you can pick up even there, some wonderful little intersections and connections deeper than you might think between John and Dame Jean, because he mentioned Dame Jean's intelligence work during the war. And John, in addition to being a great scholar and a great Sherlockian and a great academic in his way, I think is also a great American. John devoted most of his professional career, as you'll hear, to work in the Pentagon in the intelligence area. And in fact, John graduated from the University of Southern California with a Bachelor of Arts degree. And that was the University of Southern California School of International Relations. And he went on to get a Master of Arts degree and got a Master of Science degree at the National War College. So intelligence and intelligence operations was something that was John's professional background, but also he felt, and you mentioned this earlier, Scott, too, about the time in which his work with the Conan Doyle estate was so important. It was a time when he was really Dame Jean's representative in the United States to make sure that she derived the proper recognition and the proper economic value that she should when her father's work was being used and popularized and promoted and printed. And I know she was deeply grateful to him for acting in that role for so many years.
Yeah, absolutely. She really felt like John was a kindred spirit when it came to that. And he understood the family's wishes. He understood the sensitivity with which some of these things should be undertaken. And, I think through his decades of work on Doylean material, he really got a good feel for Conan Doyle and what Conan Doyle would have considered. And that actually leads pretty well into another clip I pulled from a different episode when we talked to John about the narrative of John Smith, that lost Conan Doyle manuscript. And so first of all, the original manuscript of John Smith had been lost, and Conan Doyle had written to his mother about this. He said he'd have to start it again from scratch. And it wasn't really his best work. And first of all, it wasn't finished, but also the narrative itself was a little weak, which is ironic since it was the narrative of John Smith. And in deciding whether to bring this to the public, we asked John about how he approached that. Again, keeping in mind that he had this relationship with the Doyle family, the Foley family, and wanted to do best by Sir Arthur's memory. And here's John's response.
So was the decision not to publish this? Obviously, it was unfinished for one. But do you think, in Doyle's heart of hearts, that he didn't think at that point it was up to snuff and simply did not put the effort back into it to complete it, or that he knew that it was simply not worth publishing based on what he had already put out, and decided, you know what, let's just keep this quiet?
I've tried putting myself in his head on that very point, and I don't have a very good answer. He says to his mother at the beginning that he is going to rewrite it from memory. We found, on the other hand, elements in it, things he's quoting and so forth, that were extremely fresh, freshly published. They could not have been in the earlier novel because they hadn't been published yet. So even as he was supposedly rewriting it from memory, new thoughts, new material was creeping into it. What I think he eventually concluded is that even if he might have been strengthening the novel that way, it didn't have much of a trajectory as a novel as far as plot was concerned. I have no idea how the original version of this, which did reach at some point a final page with "the end" written at the bottom of it, what that was like. because, as we said, and there's no indication that anything other than this was going to happen, it's John Smith sitting on the couch in his room, laid up by gout, ruminating about things.
Yeah. So that in itself is interesting. But then when we couple it with something that John also said in this episode, where there's actually a good deal of self-doubt that Conan Doyle has early on in his career. I mean, we think of Conan Doyle now as this master storyteller, this writer who was able to give birth to characters that certainly have outstripped him in terms of popularity and attention in the public. Yet there was a time in his career where he was still getting his feet under him. He was, a struggling physician, let's recall. And he wondered whether he'd be able to make the leap from, a contributor or article writer to an actual author.
So he's in his early 20s. He's still working a medical practice. He's in South Sea. And he has this sort of background of publishing essays and short stories. And why don't you pick it up from there?
Well, I think that background was still fairly thin at the time. He had published some stories and articles. He probably had more rejection notices than acceptances at that point. And none of them had really gotten him a great deal of attention because of that pernicious custom, as he saw it, of publishing works of fiction in magazines without any byline. So it was, he saw writing a novel as a way to get his name on the title page finally and on the spine of a volume, and actually get the whatever recognition and credit the work's merits would bring him. He was very insecure about his ability to transition from a short story writer, in which he was still striving to become quite the writer he wanted to be, to a novel, whether he could sustain the plot over the length of a novel, whether he could develop characterizations that would be sustainable at that length as well. And frankly, on the evidence of this first novel, he wasn't yet able to. But it was a very necessary step in his development as a writer. And I'm sure we'll get to the actual nature of the narrative of John Smith, but its survival provides a remarkable window into the mind of a very young 23, 24-year-old struggling writer who's basically writing in order to supplement a still very thin income as a struggling physician.
Remarkable.
Yeah, it is remarkable. And it's one of the lovely things that with these three enthusiasms, or these three areas of focus around the BSI and Doyle and Sherlock Holmes, John could do some really wonderful synthesis, but it was also always based on research in the access and study he's made over the years, he and Dan, to the letters of Conan Doyle and all these other things. The manuscript is really unique. There's no one else, I don't think, who's been down this road as deeply and as well as John did.
No, I think that's absolutely right. And we will hear a little bit more about that depth and some of those examples right after this quick word. Hey, have you checked in with our friends at MX Publishing lately? My gosh, they never stop. And that's a good thing. They currently have 3 Kickstarters running, including Sherlock Holmes and the Pandemic of Death, which has earned a Project We Love ranking from Kickstarter. In this case, Sherlock Holmes tackles a murderer during the 1918 flu pandemic. That's right, the original pandemic from 100 years ago or so. That is going on for the next 12 days or so. Still time to check that out, as well as a number of other Kickstarters there. There's also Sherlock Holmes, The Treasure of the Poison King by Paul Gilbert. And we would be remiss if we didn't also note that the MX Book of New Sherlock Holmes Stories, volumes 25 through 27, come out on May 22nd. That's right, Conan Doyle's birthday. This marks the 5 million words mark of that series. Over 570 stories, 575 stories now, 200 authors, 27 volumes, 13,000 pages. My goodness, so much to check out there at mxpublishing.com. There's something for everyone related to Sherlock Holmes at MX Publishing.
One of the big events of the Sherlockian world back in 2012 was the publication of a diary by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle that I don't believe many people knew even existed. And it went back to even before it was published. I think when it first surfaced was something like 5 or 6 years before. In any case, Scott, that was the very first question you asked John and Dan Stashower. How did anybody even know that the diary existed? And here's how John and Dan told that story.
Well, it had been part of the huge trove of Conan Doyle's papers and manuscripts that had long been locked up in a solicitor's vault because of litigation within the family. And when Dame Jean Conan Doyle realized in the summer of 1997 that she had terminal cancer, she went into overdrive to get this litigation, which is now into its second or third generation, resolved, and a division of the inheritance, the papers and the manuscripts, between her and other members of the family. And the diary in particular had been part of this its entire lifetime in family hands and locked away, and went to the heirs of Anna Conan Doyle, Adrian's widow. And it is still in the family's possession and in a safe deposit box at an undisclosed secure location in near Winchester, England. Now, how we discovered that the manuscript was there is a story that I think Dan tells very well about a trip that he and I took up to New York City.
So actually in the winter months of 2004, John and I went up on the train from Washington to see these items that were being offered in the Christie's showroom, and it was really wonderful. These items hadn't been seen for years and years and years, and I remember, for the first time, we're seeing things like the brass nameplate from the medical practice in Southsea, seeing the words Dr. Conan Doyle that hung outside of the building where Sherlock Holmes was born, and his medical armband that he wore while serving as a field surgeon in South Africa, and the Southsea notebooks in which we see the words a tangled skein written and then blotted out and replaced with the words a study in scarlet. And it's just amazing, amazing treasures. But the one item that really stood out, I think the one item that John and I agreed that if we, had world enough in time we'd like to own, was this whaling diary, which was not only an amazingly significant biographical object, but also visually stunning. We could only see one page staring up at us, but it was beautiful because you not only saw that Conan Doyle handwriting that we know from other places, but these illustrations. And we came to find out when we asked to have the diary taken out of the glass case, there were illustrations on almost every page. I think we counted 70 in all. Black
and white pen and ink drawings, some of which he had gone back later on with watercolors and worked over again. Absolutely a nice high popper.
The estimate was between 70,000 and 100,000 pounds for the Log of the Hope.
Yeah, a little rich for my blood.
So do we know what it actually fetched at auction?
It didn't fetch at auction. In fact, the family was obligated, I suppose. They felt morally obligated to include this in the auction, but it was something so special they really didn't want to part with it, and they set a very high reserve on it. And so it went unsold and remained in their hands.
Where it remains today.
Conan Doyle, the Doodler. Who knew?
Well, he came from, as we discussed with John and Dan, he came from a generation of artists and cartoonists and caricaturists,
That's right.
including Dickie Doyle. And they're very good, but it's wonderful to hear that again and to recognize how much trust the family placed in John and how attuned and empathic he was about things like the family's interest at that time. One of the things we then went on to do was to ask John to read an extract from the diary. And he selected this one because it showed Conan Doyle's innate gifts as a storyteller. And both John and Dan remark on these early signs of Conan Doyle's literary talents.
But in this particular extract from the diary, they had several disappointments previously to this when they had sighted whales, but they had failed to get them. He says at one point that he had always thought that if you saw a whale, you got your whale, and he found out that that's not true at all. It was very, very difficult to and dangerous to. This time they did. And the excerpt reads, "Nothing had been seen all day, and I had gone down to the cabin about 10 o'clock when I heard a sort of bustle on deck. Then I heard the captain's voice in the masthead, 'Lower away the 2 waste boats.' I rushed into the mate's berth and gave the alarm. Colin, the mate, was dressed, but the second mate rushed on deck in his shirt with his trousers in his hand. When I got my head above the hatchway, the very first thing I saw was the whale shooting its head out of the water and gamboling about at the other side of a large sconce piece of ice. It was a beautiful night with hardly a ripple on the deep green water. In jumped the crews into their boats, and the officers of the watch looked that their guns were primed and ready. Then they pushed off, and the 2 long whale boats went crawling away on their wooden legs, one to each side of the bit of ice, the other to the other. Carner had hardly got up to the ice when the whale came up again about 40 yards in front of the boat, throwing almost its whole body out of the water and making the foam fly. There was a chorus of, 'Now, Adam, now's your chance,' from the line of eager watchers on the vessel's side. But Adam Carner, a grizzled and weather-beaten harpooner, knows better. The whale's small eye is turned towards him, and the boat lies as motionless as the ice behind it. But now it has shifted. Its tail is toward them. 'Pull, boys, pull!' Out shoots the boat from the ice. Will the fish dive before he can get up to it? That is the question in every mind. He is nearing it, and it still lies motionless. Nearer yet, and nearer. Now he is standing up to his gun and has dropped his oar. 'Three strokes, boys,' he says as he turns the quid in his cheek. And then there is a bang and a foaming of waters and a shouting. And then up goes the little red flag in Carner's boat, and the whale line runs out merrily." Now, I know I wasn't writing text like that at the age of 20. Quite remarkable.
It's so very striking because you see so many elements of the style that we would come to know and enjoy so much. This is a textbook example of a writer who has learned to show, don't tell, in his writing.
The thrill of the chase. I mean, it's so apparent right there.
But it's so fascinating, isn't it? I mean, think about the writers, the great writers of whom we really know practically nothing. For example, Shakespeare. So if you were descended to William Shakespeare, now I'm not putting Arthur Conan Doyle in the same category as William Shakespeare, but imagine if you were a descendant of William Shakespeare and it turns out one day you've got a diary that he made on a trip when he was 20. And that's really what happened to the family when this manuscript was finally freed up from all of that litigation. And the lovely thing about the work that Dan and John did was to find these links, to be able to look at that work, but also to appreciate, because of their own deep knowledge, what it presaged, what it told you about the writer.
Yeah. Well, and let's not forget, too, that this was a trip on which Conan Doyle would become the inveterate swimmer of the ship, having been dunked a number of times into the Arctic Ocean, or was it the Arctic Ocean or
yeah.
I
think so.
Yeah, it was an Arctic whaler. So and being chided for it by his crewmates.
Yeah. We always ask our guests, particularly when we're talking about manuscripts and things like that, did you have any great surprises when you were working on this particular project? Well, when we were talking to Dan and John about Dangerous Work, they found a great surprise, a terrific link to Sherlock Holmes that they found at the end of the diary. And here's how they told us that story.
This is the next to last entry in the log. It's dated August 10th, 1880, and the voyage is almost at its end. The Hope is returning home, and they're making a brief stop at Lulenberg in the Shetland Islands, and they're letting off about a third of the crew who were Shetland Islanders. And Conan Doyle writes this passage. Passed the scary light and came down to Lulenberg, but did not get into the harbor, as we are in a hurry to catch the tide at Peterhead. A girl was seen at the lighthouse waving a handkerchief, and all hands were called out to look at her, the first woman we have seen for half a year. Our Shetland crew were landed in 4 of our boats and gave 3 cheers for the old ship as they pushed off, which were returned by the men left. Lighthouse keeper came off with last week's Weekly Scotsman, by which we learn of the defeat in Afghanistan. Terrible news. Now you can imagine how this struck our ears. John describes, as he was the one who was transcribing this passage of the log, and he describes that, he pretty much fell out of his chair.
It was certainly unexpected in this Arctic diary to find in the next to last entry a direct link to a study in Scarlet, which he would write 6 years later. I was transcribing it from camera shots, thinking this is all very interesting when suddenly I felt like I'd been struck by lightning.
And we went and we tracked down the issue of the Scotsman that he would have been looking at. 2 weeks before that Edinburgh newspaper, the Battle of Maiwand had taken place in Afghanistan. And the entry reads, "A terrible and most unlooked-for disaster has befallen the British arms in Afghanistan. Severe defeat of Burroughs' brigade retreat on Kandahar." The facts are well known. A British force of about 3,000 men had been all but annihilated at Maiwand by Pathan tribesmen. This made a lasting impression. That detail, the Army surgeon injured at Maiwand, would be put to good use, as we all know.
I used to keep secrets of my career at the Pentagon. This is what I was walking around with for about 5 years, hoping that one day we would be able to actually publish this diary, and finally we have.
I don't know about you, but I wouldn't have been able to keep mum for that long.
Isn't that amazing? Well, you see, yeah. What character? Well, we then, now that conversation happened in 2012, but 2 years before, we had the opportunity to talk to John about his only, well, I don't know if it is his only novel. It's the only novel of his that I know about, which was published at that time, called Baker Street Irregular. And it's set in the 1930s and the 1940s, and it involves a host of characters, including the founders of the Baker Street Irregulars. And I began that conversation by asking John about the 1930s. Was it a period of history that he was especially fond of? And in that part of the discussion was one of the very rare times I ever heard John speak, even generally, about his work at the Pentagon and how it led him to write this book.
Very much so. I think it's rather like the 1850s and the Civil War. 1930s was another occasion in which the political conflicts were too great to be reconciled in peaceful manners in the world. In the 1930s case, the entire world went to war. And it's a period that related very much to my work in Washington, D.C., where I spent 35 years, the last 30 of them at the Pentagon, involved in such issues. And in some ways, I wouldn't say that I wouldn't have been able to write it if I had not been at the Pentagon, but it would never have occurred to me to write it if I had not been there. I think the impulse for it, the idea for it, came in equal parts from my BSI history work and some of Pentagon life and work. It was certainly helpful to be there and to draw upon its resources to research some of the wartime intelligence activities. I did policy and strategy work in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. I don't mean his immediate office. That organization, the Office of the Secretary of Defense, is a very large one, and I was in what was called the policy cluster. Some of the work I did was analytical in nature. Some of it was operational in nature. It had to do with intelligence matters from beginning to end on a daily basis. And my last 8 years, until I retired from the Pentagon in February 2006, were spent in the Special Operations Bureau.
Yeah, it's worth noting, too, that Jon was working in his office at the Pentagon on September 11th and was quite close to, as I understood it, to where American Airlines Flight 77 struck the building, which cost the lives of 184 people on the plane and in the building. And something else he never talked about, at least not to me, but certainly must have had an effect on, dramatic effect on him.
Yeah, no doubt. Well, Jon took his work very seriously. I mean, he took his hobbies very seriously as well. There's no question that he was a thorough researcher who would seek all kinds of sources for information for crafting a well thought out and well informed story.
Yeah, very much so. And as the conversation went on, just to make that point, one of the things we had into was a discussion of prohibition. And we pointed out that just because alcohol was illegal at the time didn't mean that it was unavailable. And here's what Jon had to say about that.
It was actually more available because it was illegal. It stimulated drinking, and it stimulated the production and sale of alcohol. I don't think we would have the BSI, certainly not the one founded in 1934 by Christopher Morley and his friends, had it not been for Prohibition. The BSI was gestated in the back of Chris Cella's Speakeasy, where Woody first meets Morley and the Irregulars in late 1933. And being born in the Speakeasy accounts for the BSI's boisterous nature, its proclivity for strange rites, ribald songs about the canon's characters, some of its opaque management procedures, and down to denying the authorship of A. Conan Doyle, and of course Elmer Davis's Constitution and bylaws could not have been possible as they were written without Prohibition in the speakeasy world. To its misfortune, perhaps, the BSI has gotten very big, a little stuffy, and awfully corporate in our time. But the original BSI, Christopher Morley's and Woody Hazelbaker's BSI in the 1930s and the early 40s, was nothing like that. It was a very much smaller, much more intimate, very informal, and rather boisterous crew of people who used the Sherlock Holmes stories as an excuse to get together and socialize and carouse in a pretty well-lubricated way.
Now, it sounds like Jon Lellenberg was a throwback to Groucho Marx, that he was hankering for membership in this club that might not have had him as a member, given the exclusivity that he sought.
Well, it's interesting. He had such a nostalgia for the 1930s and the 1940s and such a love of the time and such a sense of fun of the time that he felt that anything, particularly an organization founded in that spirit, that anything that got too far away from that, was just, he didn't seem to feel any deep connection or empathy for the evolution of it, and remained, I think, to the end very, very fixated on, or fixed on, those original spirits, which are really wonderful. But as our conversation went on about his book, Baker Street Irregular, one of the things we talked about was the reluctance of the United States to enter World War II, and the public and political complexity and the feelings of the time, and how they how the feelings of the time were expressed by different members of those early Baker Street Irregulars. And here's what Jon had to say about that.
Well, this is absolutely correct. It was a time that I think has been eclipsed by the country coming together to fight the war once we were in it. But as Europe went to war, we were neutral by law as a reaction to the World War I experience. The country was strongly isolationist, and a number of very influential organizations took shape in the 1939-41 period to reinforce that isolationism and neutrality. And the most important of these was an organization founded at Yale called America First, and its principal spokesman was Charles Lindbergh, who was a true American hero if we had one at that time. So between the advocates of isolation and neutrality and those who wanted to support the Allies, and particularly Britain, and in all measures short of war, and if necessary, war itself, it was an extremely bitter debate from late 1939 to the end of 1941 when Pearl Harbor occurred. And I think many Americans have forgotten or don't realize just how bitter and divisive that debate is. And I've tried to depict it because the divisions were felt even inside the BSI. One of the three Morley brothers, Felix Morley, was one of the principal spokesmen for isolationism in the United States, then and later, while others, like Elmer Davis, were quietly, almost clandestinely involved in anti-isolationist and anti-neutrality activities. You don't see this reflected particularly in the contemporary correspondence that animates my 30s and early 40s volumes of the BSI archival histories. You see remarks, and they're usually coming from Edgar W. Smith, about basically how much he dislikes Charles Lindbergh for his position he's taking. The BSI were indeed very divided themselves on this. Mostly they were pro-British. I mean, they were all Anglophiles, of course. Many of them had studied in England. A couple of them were actually English by birth. And they became involved in these activities. And occasionally, at least in one principal case, and that being Fletcher Pratt, I decided I would write him into these activities. And then, in the course of subsequent research, discovered that I wasn't actually making this up. He had been. And it's a story that is not well known among Sherlockians and Baker Street Irregulars. And it's something I've been very happy to have the opportunity to tell in this novel.
Well, given what we know about Charles Lindbergh now, I am grateful to Edgar Smith for his position.
Yeah. It really is an enjoyable novel. It's a love letter to people who would like to cast away the present and dwell for an hour or two in those offices on those streets with those issues. But it's interesting to hear the level of truth and accuracy Jon brought to his work to try to portray the conversations, the discoveries, the discussions, the decision about entering the war. And it's interesting, in some things I've seen, recently, in terms of films and programs, more of that is coming up that, I think is, a fact about people taking another look back at those days. And last, in this conversation, one of the things we asked Jon was if any of his friends or colleagues had read the book and were surprised to find out there was a Sherlock Holmes Society back in the 1930s. And he found that some of his former colleagues also loved Sherlock Holmes, and here's how he told us that.
I'm discovering things about my friends. When I was at the Pentagon, and I also had this very active life at the Baker Street Irregulars, I did my best to compartmentalize those two parts of my life, not let them interpenetrate, and certainly not let the BSI penetrate my professional life. And I mostly got away with it. I can only think of in the mid-years of one case where my name appeared in a an Atlantic Monthly article, and somebody I worked with asked if that was me, and I said, no, that's the other Jon Lellenberg, and he said he worked for CIA. I think he actually believed that. When Caleb Carr's novel, The Italian Secretary, was published in around 2004 or so, he asked me to write an afterword for it. That really blew my cover in my own life, because I found that he had a surprising following for his fiction among special operations officers. And I was working in that part of the community at the time, and I started hearing from special forces officers and other special ops people from coast to coast about this, which made me decide probably it was a good thing that I was getting close to leaving the life, coming in from the cold, so to speak. But I think, well, even in my old profession, you hear of Sherlock Holmes everywhere.
The BSI who came in from the cold. No question.
Amen.
Yeah.
Amen.
Well, isn't it interesting that Sherlock Holmes, who was covert himself for well over a year in the Irish secret society in Buffalo and other activities when he was doing his covert operation in advance of von Bork and his last bow, isn't it interesting that it would be Sherlock Holmes that would out John?
Well, I never thought of that. Yeah. But it's a wonder, John, we haven't talked about so many things about John, but the good thing is we can focus on hearing his voice. He was a contributing editor to Baker Street Miscellany for years. We began looking at some of his Baker Street Journal appearances, and they are too numerous to mention. And, it's a terrific thing to be able to look back on just these 4 examples of his contributions and to recognize what he's brought to our collective interest in Doyle and Sherlock Holmes, Christopher Morley, and the Baker Street Irregulars.
Absolutely. And there's so much more to explore on John's website, bsiarchivalhistory.org. It's not necessarily the most intuitively organized site. There's a lot to explore there. There's some hidden items there as well. But we'll provide the main site as well as a few links. There's a series of 5 essays that John was working on. I think his hope was to eventually do a biography of Edgar W. Smith. There's a series of 5 wonderful essays to help you get to know Smith a little better as well. So those are worth looking through, as well as the editor's gas bag and disputations and essays and blogs and links and all that kind of stuff. So we'll have a link to John's website as well. I mean, ultimately, how do we sum this up? I mean, boy, John and Dan did Arthur Conan Doyle, A Life in Letters. Jon Lellenberg is a life in not only letters, but essays and articles and books and editing and commentary and appearing on I Hear of Sherlock everywhere. A lot of things there. But he was really a multifaceted man who contributed so much to the world of Sherlock Holmes and Arthur Conan Doyle.
Hear, hear. Arthur Conan Doyle wrote 22 novels. The one he thought his best is an adventure story of knights and chivalry. 20-year-old Alan Edrickson travels the world encountering bullies, con artists, thieves, a damsel in distress, and 2 men who become his closest friends. Together they join the White Company, archers and fighters led by the gallant Sir Nigel Loring. Will our hero win the hand of Loring's romantic daughter Maud? Will the chivalrous Prince Edward restore Peter of Castile to his Spanish throne? Published in 1891 and never out of print, The White Company is a tale of pageantry and piracy, heraldry and hope, published now in an exclusive annotated edition with the original N.C. Wyeth illustrations in blazing color. Don't you owe it to yourself to read Conan Doyle's favorite book? Get the annotated White Company at wessexpress.com.
Oh boy, oh boy, oh boy. You know what that song means, Bert. Well, it's time to get your turtle wax out. And it's also time for everyone's favorite Sherlockian quiz show. That's right. It's Canonical Couplets, where we give you 2 lines of poetry, and you are supposed to name the Sherlock Holmes story in question. Now, the last time we were here, we gave you this clue. A famous year for Sherlock Holmes, of triumphs 'twas no lack. But why the morning journey to the butcher's then and back? Bert, do you know which Sherlock Holmes story this refers to?
Yes, I do. That is the strange case of the policeman who hired Violet Hunter to do his laundry. That's the case they called the Copper's Bleaches.
Wow. I'm going to have to say no on that one. No. Shocking, I know. We were looking for Black Peter. The Adventure of Black Peter. Yeah.
Goodness. Oh, yeah. Well.
I know. Well, we got a lot of good entries on that one, including our friend Eric Deckers. Eric Deckers, who was able to come to your rescue again, Bert.
Thank goodness.
And he did guess the Adventure of Black Peter, but he also said, at first, I thought the answer to the canonical couplet was harpooner. I nearly killed her. Thanks for that, Eric. Well, good thing we had the canned laughter available. It covers up the groans and the bleedings. So what we will do here is we will pull out our big prize wheel and give it a big spin. There it goes. And it's slowing down. Arriving at number 28. Number 28. And that gives us, oh my goodness. I hope I don't butcher this name, speaking of butchers, Marketa Kosi. Marketa Kosi from the Czech Republic. I think this is our first entry from the Czech Republic. We had a few this time around. It could be from that wonderful Sherlockian-Sherlock.com link that we have. We promoted some material from that website, which is based in Czechoslovakia. So, Marketa, congratulations. You will be getting a copy of the Sherlock Holmes Society of London anniversary book, This August and Scholarly Body. So we'll have that sent off to you. And now it's time for this episode's canonical couplet. Bert, are you ready?
I'm ready.
All right, then. Here we go. Mrs. Warren's lodger paid her well, £5 a week. To pierce the lodger's mystery, in a mirror Holmes would peek. If you know the answer to this canonical couplet, put it in an email addressed to comment@ihearofsherlock.com with canonical couplet in the subject line. If you are among the correct answers and we choose you at random, you will win our prize. Good luck. And just a reminder, that prize is The Quest for Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, 13 Biographers in Search of a Life, edited by Jon Lellenberg, with a foreword by Dame Jean Conan Doyle. Fantastic, fantastic opportunity there. Well, Bert, any other words of wisdom before we wrap up today?
Words of wisdom. No, I can't think of anything. I'm just sort of continuing my voyage down the construction of end-to-end user-sensitive platforms that provide a consistent brand experience and treat each one of my clients' ethoses as if it were my own, because that's the sort of fellow I am.
Wow. If I didn't know you, I would have no idea you're in marketing and communications.
If you didn't know me, you wouldn't want to.
Oh, well, until we come back here next time on the 30th of the month, I remain the knowable Scott Monty.
And I'm just left behind as the ignorant Burt Wolder.
And together we say, the game's afoot.
The game's afoot.
I'm afraid that in the pleasure of this conversation, I am neglecting business of importance, which awaits me elsewhere.
Thank you for listening. Please be sure to join us again for the next episode of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, the first podcast dedicated to Sherlock Holmes.
Goodbye, and good luck, and believe me to be, my dear fellow, very sincerely yours, Sherlock Holmes.